So I'm going to talk about a lot about user research and understanding who are the people that you're serving, who are the people you're building your products and services for, and how to get the best understanding so you can build the best things to have the best impact. Start off with a little story about from a keynote I went to at South by Southwest a number of years ago. A very, very wonderful, very smart product thinker, Kathy Sierra. She asked the audience this question: what would you rather have people say? How great your company or team is, or how great your product is? So some people raise their hand for A, some people raise their hand for B. And of course, you should know if anyone ever gives you two options, there's always a third one that's the right answer. And of course, the answer here is C, how great I am because of your product or service. It's not about you being a great company or team. It's not about the product you build being great. It's about making other people great because of what you do. And because of that, the people you serve, they're rooting for you. They need you to do an awesome job so that they can be awesome. There's another way that Kathy puts this. She has this graph she calls the kick-ass curve. And so we look at ability over time. And there's these two thresholds. One at the bottom is the suck threshold. And when you're underneath that, your ability is low. That's when you're figuring things out and you're like, oh, I'm not good at this. I'm terrible. I don't understand how this works. And you're really just focusing on how to get the tools to work, not the work itself. And then there's the passion threshold. And that's kind of when you're in flow. Like you're not thinking about the tools. You're not even thinking about time. You're just kind of getting things done. The tool almost becomes invisible. You're just focused on the work. Now, the longer you keep people in the suck threshold, the more miserable they are, the more likely they are to leave and complain and just, be very unhappy with what you're providing. And the faster you get them up into flow, um, the more the better the work they're going to produce, the more they're going to love what you do. And again, better results all around. So how do you do that? I mean, part of it, you just have to understand who are you serving, what are their needs, what are their mental models, so you can match that. So you make decisions and build products that can match that. The way to do that is you have to talk to people, you have to observe them, you ask good questions, you follow up. Unfortunately, a lot of people are just kind of reluctant to do that. Like we know where the users are, and we just like resist actually engaging with them. Now, some teams are better than others. Your mileage may vary, but there's a lot of good reasons for this. For a lot of people, it's outside their comfort zone. It's just not what they were trained to do. Some people would rather just work and code and not interact with people. Some people are just worried that their assumptions might be proved wrong, or you know what, they're busy. I just got to build stuff. I don't have time for this user research stuff. Um, and maybe ask, well, do I really need to do this? Well, here's a way to think about if you do or not. So this is a simple model, and every consultant, you got to have a 2x2 matrix and a presentation. So here's this one. Think about your level of uncertainty and the cost of being wrong, right? If your uncertainty is low, you're fairly confident and it's inexpensive to be wrong, easy to fix, won't cause too much damage. Yeah, sure, try it out, measure, see what happens. If one of those things is high, you might want to do a little investigation. And if both of those things are high, you want to be doing a lot of validation before you move forward. Now, one thing that I will say is the smarter you are, and you're all probably very, very smart people, the more likely you are is to overestimate your level of confidence. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about what is your level of uncertainty. Now, we're going to make this easier, removing all those things about comfort zone, et cetera, because I'm going to give you a plan for how to approach it. And at a very basic level, it breaks down to, why, who, what, and how. So fairly straightforward. So let's start with the why. Now, what's going to be the focus of this initiative, of this experiment? We likely can't learn everything and we can't test everything. It would take too long and people only have so much patience and we only have so much time. So we're going to need to focus. So here are a couple questions that'll help you focus on what the why is for any kind of user research initiative. First question is, what do we need to learn? A lot of times we think about outcomes, what we want to achieve, but for this is there's usually something we need to learn. If we can kind of think about that, that'll help us focus. Another way to refine that is to think about what are all the reasons we think this will succeed? And this gets to some of our assumptions. How do we know it's going to succeed? What's the source of that information? Is it directly from users? Is it from someone who's a few degrees removed from users? So maybe it's from someone who works with users. Okay, that's still probably reliable. But the farther you get from the people who are actually using the product or have the problem, the more that the reliability of that insight degrades. the age of that information. It could be, well, I used to be that person. I know what they do, but I used to be in that role 10 years ago. Well, maybe the role's changed in 10 years. So maybe there's a risk there that the assumptions of someone who's not in that role anymore might be a little different, or maybe their focus is different. I worked for a startup many years ago that was a social network for physicians to help them kind of collaborate on difficult medical cases, get feedback from each other. And the founder was a former surgeon. He knew more about what it meant to be a practicing surgeon than I will ever know. But at that moment in his career, he was a CEO of a company and he thought about this product most waking moments of his life. But we expected people to use the product for maybe 10 to 15 minutes a day in between seeing patients. And just that difference of expertise is huge. So you have to, even there, like, your knowledge is going to be so much greater as the people building tools than where you live and breathe that versus the people who are using the tools, even if you both came from the same background. So kind of these are all things to kind of think about when you're kind of looking at your level of confidence and how well you might think you understand a problem. I also kind of, there's another technique I jokingly referred to as the Rumsfeld technique, because he kind of popularized the model. He applied it in the wrong way, but the model itself works. Like, what are the known knowns, your known unknowns, and your unknown unknowns? Now, the known knowns are the things you believe to be true. And if they're important, we can validate that they're true. Your known unknowns are the things you don't know. Like, oh, so there's a way to find answers to those questions. The unknown unknowns are the questions you didn't even think to ask. And we'll talk about some ways to explore and discover those, but those are often areas for really true innovation. And finally, the last question, if we're wrong, we're in a lot of trouble. So sometimes, like, if this doesn't work out, what is the thing? If we're wrong about this, it kind of sinks the whole project. And frankly, it's a bit of a dark pattern, but fear can be a great motivator. I was working for a online gaming company a number of years ago, and we were one of the bigger poker sites in France. At the time, France was what you would call a gray market. White market is where things are regulated. A black market is where things are illegal. A gray market is where it's neither. There are no laws, pro or con. And at the time, France was a gray market. Now, of course, the government of France saw this money moving around. They said, we want to tax that. So they put a framework in place to make online poker legal. Now, one of the things they said is that if you want to get a license to operate in the country, when the market opens, you have to wipe your membership database clean and recruit everyone from scratch. And I don't know if you know anything about poker, but poker is a game you play with other people. So if you're the first person on the platform, there's no one there to play with. So it's a real big risk that it would be a really hard opening. Also, we weren't the biggest player, so we had a loyal base of players, but the regulations were going to require certain things in sign up that no one had ever had to do before, and they were kind of like giving personal information. So we had this fear that what would happen was people would come to our site, our old players would come back, they would see that they had to do all this stuff they never had to do before and go, I don't want to do this. And then they would go to the competitor and see the same thing there. But would they come back to us or go, well, I'm already on the bigger site. Maybe I'll just stay here and I'll create an account here. That was a huge existential risk. And all of a sudden, I had budget to go do usability testing of our sign-up process in France to make sure we got it right. So I don't recommend using fear, but frankly, some people are more motivated by risk than reward. You can also think about where in the assumption hierarchy are you trying to hit, right? There's a base level of product that you want to be useful. You want to solve a problem. But then there's a value. Does someone care about that problem? One of my favorite examples of this is I have an Apple Watch, and one of the things it does is fall detection. If it thinks that you fell, it will say, I think you fell. If you're okay, let me know. And if not, I'm going to call 911. Now, for most people, that's neat, but it's probably not that valuable. So it's useful. It works, but may not be that valuable. However, I'm a cyclist, and if I were to get hit by a car, that could be a really valuable life-saving thing. Or maybe for someone who's elderly, where risk of fall is pretty severe, again, that could be a really valuable feature. So just because you solve a problem doesn't mean someone cares about that problem. So at the base level, you can test utility. Is this thing that I'm building actually working to solve the problem? Do people care about the problem? Now, usable is, can I actually get value from it? Can I extract the value? Because if I build something and someone can't figure out how to use it, or it's too hard to use, then it's not usable. They can't actually get that valuable. And lastly, is that enjoyable? And that's kind of what, when we're looking at the kick-ass curve, do they get into flow? So if, on the Apple Watch example, they've automated the usable part because it happens automatically. And while I wouldn't necessarily call it enjoyable, it might be life-saving, which I would say is pretty damn positive. So you can think about where are your features and where are you trying to measure about the question you're trying to ask around what you want to test. So that might inform your learning goal. So these are all different lenses to think about your why. Why do we need to talk to people? Why are we doing research? So next we're going to talk about who. Um, and even when we think about who, we're kind of a lot of looking at behavior. And we can look at behavior in the quantitative and qualitative. So quantitative, we're going to look at our data, versus the qualitative is a little more story oriented, and it's a bit of a quantitative more on the validation side versus qualitative a little bit more about exploring the problem. So obviously you've got data, especially if you have a tool already, you can look at your analytics, you can look at the whatever data you have in your databases to kind of measure activity and see, does the activity match what you expect it to? And if it doesn't, then there might point you to areas for further research. Ideally, you want to combine the qualitative and quantitative. The quantitative gives you a lot of what, but no why, and the qualitative gives you a lot of why, but smaller sample size. So they both work well together. Also, on the quantitative side, surveys, right? You can craft a bunch of questions. You can send them out to a large number of people. So you can get to quantitative, statistically significant. You can have results very quickly, but you're gonna have a limited focus, because you only get the answers to the questions you ask. And while that seems obvious, if someone gives you an answer that doesn't make sense, you can't really ask a follow-up in a survey. You can certainly add the text box, but most people don't like typing. So you very rarely get good, useful information in the open field boxes in a survey. Some tips if you do decide to use surveys is you want them as short as possible. The more questions you add, the more likely people are to drop off. You want to make the questions as clear as possible and limit the use of jargon. Now, I know folks here are in very specific scientific fields and the jargon might be unavoidable, but anytime you're kind of framing these questions, think about if you can ask the question in a simpler way without using some of that technical speak, because you'll be surprised that you may run into people that don't necessarily understand all the language that you do, being experts in your field. Surveys work better with closed-ended questions with fixed answers rather than open-ended ones that like people don't really like to type a lot. And you want to match the question type to the learning goal. And I'll give you an example of that. Let's say there was 5 problems I'm thinking about solving, and I want to know which of these problems are most critical to people. So I send out a survey and I have a question on there. Here are these 5 problems. Rate each one from 1 to 5, 1 being it's not important, 5 being it's an absolute deal breaker. I absolutely need that to be solved. That seems reasonable, right? Of course, the downside is someone could put 5s for all of them. Like, oh, that's not very helpful. So maybe I could have them rank them in order from 1 to 5. Okay, well, now I get an ordering 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But what that might not tell me is that actually 1 and 2 are critical. I don't care at all about 3, 4, and 5. So you see, I'm going to learn different things, whether I do an ordering, a forced prioritization versus just a general numeric ranking, or a value rank for each one. So depending on which is more important to me, I might phrase my question differently. So just think about that as how the format that you use for a question is going to give you a different type of answer. Your phrasing is also really critical because phrasing, how we word things, can introduce bias. So we want to try and be as neutral as possible unless our intention is to frame the question. An example, and it's kind of going to our next thing on usability testing, it's common to ask people, when people say, well, what do you like about what you see? Well, you can always see that is, I am cutting off a lot of possible answers with that question. Like, just what are the positives? Now, I might want to do that. There might be a good reason for that. But a more neutral question would be, what's your reaction to this? That's much more open-ended. It'll widen the spectrum of possible answers that I'm given. So how we phrase things, even in surveys, can be really important. So I'm going to talk about 3 different ways to deal with get insights from users. Surveys is the first. The second is usability testing. Usability testing is when you have a product, yours or potentially someone else's. You sit down with a user and you give them tasks to do, and you see how well it works. You're evaluating the product, though, not the person. It's not about how well they perform the task. It's how well is the product suited to the task and how well do they understand it. If the person struggles, it's not a problem with the person, it's a problem with the product. And it's a very important thing. And it's something that I also add in my introductions. It helps kind of people relax. We're not testing them, we're testing the products. Um, Whereas surveys are more quantitative and more about validation, usability testing is a little bit more qualitative. It's a smaller sample size, usually 5 to 8 people per persona or per profile type. And it's a bit of a balance of exploration and validation. Because unlike a survey where, again, you only get the answers to the questions you ask, because it's a usability testing is typically live, kind of one-on-one, if you see or hear things that don't necessarily make sense, you can ask follow-up questions to really understand them. And then this kind of just helps you really get inside the heads of the people that you're trying to serve, kind of develop better empathy. Now there's 3 basic components. You're going to develop a test script. The test takes place usually in a space. It could be a real or virtual space. And you typically have 2 people, well, 2 people plus participant, one person who's facilitating and one person who's taking notes. And it's important to do that to separate those roles. One, because it is very hard to both capture the conversation while also thinking about good follow-up questions. So if I'm a facilitator, it takes a lot of pressure off if I can just focus on the participant and the conversation and what they're doing and asking good questions, and I'm not worried about capturing notes. Now, you could say, well, why don't you just record the session, which we will. But you know what? Tech goofs happen. So if for some reason the recording doesn't happen, you at least have the notes that were taken live as a backup. And these sessions are so valuable that you don't want to lose the content that gets generated. Now there's also unmoderated testing, and there's some sites like usertesting.com where you can, if you have a public version of your product or prototype, you kind of put it out there, you create the script, you send that to other people, they record themselves going through the steps, and they record usually talking out loud what their reactions are. You can execute that very fast, and it's a little bit more on that qualitative side, but again, you don't have that ability to ask follow-up questions as you do in a live usability test. So the 4 parts of a usability test script: you're going to have an introduction. And I can share examples of this with folks. We're going to talk about what you're going to test, that you're testing the product, not them, that you want them to think out loud. That they can take a break. There's a lot of kind of things just to set up. And then I like to start with some background questions. I might even already know the answers to these based on the survey or something else, but there might be some things I don't know, and it gives me information about that person. But I'm also going to craft those questions around typically how they solve the problem that we're looking at, that we're going to test, how they solve it now. Again, it's not only good context, but it also helps put them in the frame of mind of that problem. So it kind of primes them for what we're going to do in the task. And then we'll have the task that they'll do, and then we kind of close it out with a couple kind of wrap-up questions. So a couple quick tips. Thinking out loud is really important because you can watch someone do something, but you really want to understand why they're doing it and what they're thinking as they do. So one of the constant things that I'm always doing in usability testing is getting people to think, asking them questions. What's your reaction to this? What are you looking for? Does this match your expectations? Just something that kind of keeps them talking so I can understand what's going on inside their head. You can also test competitive products. You don't have to just test your products. If there's another uh, platform or tool that does something similar, you can usability test that. You can also test analogous tasks. Let's say you're doing something around data exploration. Maybe you're thinking about copying how another tool does data exploration. You can test that tool and see how people respond to their model. And then you can, copy the things that work well and improve on the things that don't. And you save yourself a ton of time and iteration by not having to kind of learn by just copying theirs and then learning what doesn't work. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some facilitation tips later, but I have a ton of those at the end of the presentation here. And the last technique I'm going to talk about is ethnography. And this is where you're observing someone doing the work in the way that they would normally do it. So in this case, it might be that instead of bringing them to my space and they're going to use my prototype and I'm going to tell them what to do, I might say, I'm interested in how you solve this problem. And maybe can you save that work until we're together? And then I'll go to their space if I can physically, or at least, they may share their screen if we're doing it virtually. And I'm going to watch them do that work the way they do it now. Um, so I might see not only what tools they use, but who they interact with. There's a lot that I can get there. Again, very small sample size, very open-ended, and this is more on the exploratory side. Um, right. Now for some tips similar to usability research, and I'll go into some more of these later, as I said, the one of the key things is you want to go to them as much as possible. If it's possible to be in their physical space, great. Virtual is okay, but you're going to learn more. If someone's got a list of things taped to their monitor, that's really interesting to see. If they have to go switch over to their email to check something that got sent 2 weeks ago that they bookmarked, that's really interesting to see. These parts of the process that might not be obvious otherwise if you're outside of their space. Um, One of the key things here also is this idea of think like an apprentice. Because often when we're thinking about research, we think about we're the superior being and we're studying these other lowly people. We're the experts and they're not. And we want to reverse that. The people we're talking to are the experts in how they solve their problem. And that's what we want to understand. Um, they might not solve it in the best way, but that's also really interesting to know. Like one of the more extreme examples, I was working for an online jewelry startup, and we knew that if someone wants to do a surprise proposal, they struggle to get the ring size right. Right. I mean, if you're going to propose to someone, you want to have that magic moment. You slip the ring on their finger, and if it's too big and falls off or it can't quite fit, less than ideal. But you don't want to ask them either. So we knew there's some struggles around this. So this is what we were testing. We were testing with heterosexual couples at the time. So we had a bunch of guys in who were planning a proposal, and we got to this part of the test with one particular participant, and the facilitator asks, so how do you know what the ring size is? And this person says, well, it's the same as her shoe size. And maybe that was coincidence, but it's certainly not a universal principle. Also, the folks who were observing found this very amusing and cracked up. And thankfully, the observation room, this was in a physical space, was not near the testing room, which is good in case anything like this happens. Now, just because this person got it really wrong, sure, you can laugh at that. But what it told us was we have a lot of education that needs to be done. We have to work really hard to make sure that people understand how to do this well, because we want them to have the best experience. Again, it's not about us as a jewelry making company. It was about, can we give this person the best proposal possible so they have a memorable moment? That's the thing that we're going for. And so again, them getting this right and making sure we educate them to get it right is going to be really important, because the knowledge gap is huge. This is probably the one where a skilled facilitator makes the biggest difference, because they'll be able to ask better questions, keep them open-ended, et cetera. Now, there are lots of other ways you can get user insights. There's card sorting to help you understand how people group concepts. You can create forums for people to communicate where you can kind of get feedback on a regular basis about what you're doing. You can do proxy interviews if you can't get to actual users. There's lots of other things. I do want to talk about focus groups. I hit on them briefly. I am not a fan of focus groups. They tend to be dominated by the loudest person, and that can anchor the conversation. So and you only end up going to get a few minutes of input from a couple people. There's just a lot of reasons why they tend not to work well, and they're very hard to facilitate. So rather than doing a focus group of 6 people, it's far better to try one-on-one interviews or one-on-one sessions with those same 6. Yes, it's more time, but you will get infinitely better insights. So those are some things on the what you can do. And I'll talk a little bit about how to go about it. So some of the things you have to find people to recruit. If you can recruit internal users, those are often a good place to start. They may have a lot of that extra knowledge about the platform that might bias them a little bit, but it's a good place to start. But it can be harder to talk to. What I mean? Oh, I know what I meant by that. Sometimes there's a resistance to connect you with people. Now, maybe this is less in the scientific space, but certainly in the commercial space, there can be a reluctance to connect people who are not sales folks or customer care with customers. They put a roadblock there. But what this does, what I found is that actually doing this research demonstrates to the people you're serving that you have expertise. You're listening to them. It helps build a relationship, because you're demonstrating that you care about their problem and you're listening to them. So I find that it can be really positive. Um, Obviously, if you can get external users, it's even better. There are services that will help you recruit if you don't know who your users might be, or you want to get people outside your existing network. Um, you may have to pay an honoraria, but you might not. Like if you end up having to pay, it's weird, but the more you pay, the more likely people are to show up. But often you can just appeal to either ego, like you're a really smart person and we really care about, your opinion on this. Like, and I am a really smart person. Of course, I want to give my opinion on this. Or even we're going to make a product that's going to help you and people like you. So if you give your opinions, it's going to fit your work better. Like, yeah, well, I need this product to work well. So I want to give you my feedback, right? Going back to the beginning, I need you to do an awesome job so I can be great at what I do. And then there are ways to create screeners. There are like surveys to make sure that if you have a pool of people that you could approach, how do you get to the right people who are going to really match the segment that you're going to want to test with? Again, people have questions on it. I can talk about this at greater length. Um, I put together this thing kind of that also I think might help folks. And this is largely based on work by Jeff Patton. I just added a little bit to it. Basically, I added the number 6. He's got this learning canvas, and it's kind of just a way to uh, put this plan together. So you start out with, what's your hypothesis? Your bet. Like, we think that this is the current situation. If we do this thing, we're going to get this result. Okay, cool. What are the assumptions that are going into that, or the open questions, your known knowns and your known unknowns that you might need to validate? So that's kind of like, think about all the possible things that you might need to learn here. You go up to 3. What's the most important one we need to learn now? What's the most important problem, question, et cetera, to address? And over to 4, what are all the different ways that we might learn that thing? Maybe we could do interviews, we could send out a survey, we could do some usability testing, maybe we could just launch something and look at our analytics, lots of different ways. So over to 5, what's going to have the best ROI, the best insight for investment? And then where I think 6 comes in is, what did we actually learn? And then that kind of feeds back into the beginning again. Now did that change our hypothesis? Or is there do we need to now move down to our second most important assumption or question and maybe test that? So if you kind of can have this as a one pager, not only can it help you plan, but it can be very helpful as a reference for maybe people who weren't part of that research, because you can kind of start collecting these things, and they'll at least be, I don't know, I kind of think of them as like those old fashioned library index cards. It'll tell you where to look. Like, oh, I want to understand this survey or this activity that we did, which produced these results. And I can go dive into the data, but this kind of can tell me all about the different research initiatives we've done. All right, so that's a little bit about our why, our who, our what, and a little on the how. I know, again, I'll have time for questions at the end. I want to talk a little bit about some facilitation master tips. Because how you facilitate, especially in these one-on-one small group sessions, can make a huge difference on the value of the insights that you get. So the first one is, you want to create an environment that is comfortable. You don't want someone to feel like they're a research subject. So, if you're in a physical space, like, it's just the facilitator and a note taker and the participant. So it's them with 2 people, and it's mostly them having a conversation with the facilitator, with the note taker chiming in occasionally. And when they'll chime in, I kind of hinted about an observation room before. It's great to have a place where other people can watch, like remotely. And if that room has a question, they can kind of message the note taker, who can then find an appropriate time to interrupt and ask. It's a little bit different if you're doing it virtually, because it's a little hard to have 2 rooms. So you might still have lots of people in the room, but I would still suggest that they message the note taker privately, so you don't have tons of people interrupting the conversation. Because it would, if you're sitting there and you're aware that there's a dozen people watching you, it can feel a little bit intimidating. You also want to maintain a neutral attitude, maybe just slightly positive. You don't want to be cold, because that's off-putting, but you also don't want to be too encouraging, because the more you say like, "Oh, that's great," you know, that if I praise the outcome, that's something that someone does, they start to get a sense that, oh, there's actually a right answer here. And now instead of giving you my opinion and my genuine reaction, I'm trying to give you what I think you want to hear. And that's not what you want to hear. You want the genuine reaction. So if I'm going to give someone a compliment, it's more about the clarity of their insight, that I appreciate more than the correctness of it. Or I appreciate how they were able to articulate it, or thank you for sharing that. But nothing about um, that's where I'll give value, not about like whether they did something right or not. Because then I don't want that to bias their future answers. As I said before, you want to keep it simple, as clear language as possible, eliminating as much jargon. Sometimes, again, in a very specialized field, there are terms that are important. They mean very specific things, and you're going to want to use those. But as much as possible, kind of simplify the language, just on the off chance you end up talking to someone who doesn't use the same terms you do. Um, this is really important. Keeping it open. Open-ended questions get far better answers. Um, I say if I say, "Did you eat breakfast this morning?" You can say yes or no. That doesn't really tell you much. What did you have for breakfast? Okay, that gives me a little bit more information. Tell me about your morning routine. Again, much more open. And again, depending on what I'm trying to learn, I don't know breakfast, but anyway, depending on what I'm trying to learn, the more open in the question, the wider my possible responses are. Now, there might be reasons I want to ask a bounded question because I'm focusing in on a specific topic, but I will still typically start with bigger, wider questions to kind of maybe see what interesting things come in, and then focus on more and more narrow questions. Now, again, this is a difficult thing for folks to do. So sometimes we will, out of reactions, just ask a um, closed-ended question as a follow-up. You catch yourself doing it, that's fine. Follow that with an open-ended question. And that will help kind of, again, get you more of the insights you're looking for. You want to avoid hypothetical questions. What would you do in this situation? Highly unreliable. Observing is the best. Like I said, we talked about contextual inquiry, or ethnography, I think is what I refer to it. Contextual inquiry is another term in UX for similar to ethnography. You want to watch people doing things. That's the most reliable insights. If you can't do that, ask them to recall a prior example. Not what would you do if you were doing this type of research? Tell me about the last research project you did when you were looking to find data for it, as opposed to what would you do to find data in the future? That's, recalled is better than imagining the future. Talked about thinking like an apprentice, hit on that one already. Thinking out loud so you can understand them better. And there's three different questioning techniques: echo, boomerang, and mumble. And echo, facilitating user research is not like a normal conversation. In a normal conversation, there's give and take, but in the sense that we both add to the content of the conversation. But when you're doing user research, you don't want to add to the content of the conversation. You only want the other person to add because, again, you don't want to introduce bias. So if someone asks a question of you, echo is you echo it. You just say what they say. Sorry, not asking a question. Someone says something and they stop. In a normal conversation, that's your cue that it's your turn to talk. So someone says, well, the next thing I would do is I would download this data, and they pause. Well, they expect you to fill it in, but you don't want to add meaning. So you echo back. Oh, so the next thing you do is download the data. Just repeat it back, what they just said. And they go, oh yeah. And then I would do this other thing, right? You took your turn in the conversation, but you didn't add anything to the meaning. You kind of ping ponged it back to them. Now it's their turn. They are the ones that add more meaning. So that's the echo part. Boomerang's the question one. If someone asks you a question, well, what would this button do? You don't want to answer the question because, again, you're going to imply that there's a right answer and you're not going to learn what they think. So you boomerang it back and say, well, what do you expect it would do? What do you think it would do? What would be valuable for it to do? So you boomerang, when they ask a question, you don't answer it, you boomerang it back. And mumble, kind of inspired by this 70s TV detective Kojak, who kind of had this mumbling tone, but it's a good way to get people to talk. If you're not sure what question to ask, you can kind of take the echo approach, and you can you slow down your speech, uh, adding a lot of kind of uncomfortable pauses, and people don't really like that, just naturally. So they will tend to just jump in and start talking more. So if you're not sure what to do next, just slow down, pause, mumble a bit. The other person will probably start to pick it up and continue telling their story. So that's echo, boomerang, and mumble. As I said before, one of the best things about real time research is you can follow the thread. If someone says or does something that doesn't make sense to you, you can ask them about it. See why. You might be willing to take an interesting detour from your test script to explore what could be um, a really novel approach to things. Now, it could be an idiosyncratic approach that no one else has, and you're like, well, we're going to discard this. But it could be, yeah, what I've often found is it it leads you to someplace interesting. Maybe someone is just able to articulate something that other people haven't. Um, I've had some really unusual um, results lead to some pretty interesting innovation. I have a patent on one of them. Um, I used to work for Xerox many years ago, and I was doing basically print drivers for massive printers. You kind of put a tree in one end, you get a book out the other. And um, we're doing a card sorting exercise, which is you put different concepts on cards and you ask people to group them to kind of understand how they relate to different concepts, and then they name their groups. If you're interested in this, I'm happy to talk more about how to facilitate that. Um, so usually people would have like half a dozen different groups to grouping different features together. But this one person had two groups. And we're watching that going, well, this is unusual. Two groups, huh? And then when it came time to name them, the person wrote things I do every day, things I never do. And at first it was like odd, and we almost discarded it, except we started to really observe that in these different shops we were going to kind of specialized in different types of things that they did. So while the machines could do all kinds of stuff, they only used a fraction of the capabilities of each machine, but each place was a different fraction. So we actually have a patent on a way for administrators to control how you tab through an interface so that they could say, well, here's the most common things people do. We'll control the tab order so people can be really fast. They were keyboard driven. They still have access to the rest of the interface if they want to do the other things they don't normally do, but this would make them really fast and make them get their job done more easily. And that kind of came out of that one person's odd grouping of in our card sorting exercise. So you follow the thread, you get to some interesting points. Um, no instructions. This is hard, especially for people building products. If someone is stuck, you want to tell them how to do it. But again, it biases them. It teaches them there's a right answer, and you're not going to understand what they need. So ask questions when if someone is struggling a little bit, because your job is to learn, not to teach. And the only exception I'll say is if someone is just blocked and they can't figure out what to do next, you might point out like the path forward with the acknowledgement, like this wasn't clear to you, was it? Maybe what you could have hypothetical, like, well, what could have been done? What were you expecting to see? And they'll tell you at least what they were expecting, and then you can kind of show them how it moves on just to get them to the next step because you don't want to be someone to be frustrated and completely blocked. But again, and giving any kind of instruction like that is kind of last resort. There's no answers. Again, boomerang it back. Someone asks you a question, you don't answer it. You say, what would you want? What would you expect? Don't add to the pool of meaning. Second to last, no excuses. There's a tendency, especially in the early phases when a product is young or you're testing a design, say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, this doesn't work. It's terrible, blah, blah, blah." In the beginning, you can acknowledge, say, this is a prototype and it may not work the way you expect, and some things might not work at all, but that's okay. Treat it as if it was a fully fleshed product because I want to understand how you'd use it. But that's it. No more excuses after that. And lastly, record everything. You want to inform them that you're going to record it. And I'll often add context like it's never going to be public. We're never going to share it with anyone. It's just so that we can validate our notes. And if we have a question on what we wrote down in our notes, we can go back to the video and see what that referred to. In almost 3 decades of doing this, I had one person ask that we delete the video after we'd clarified our notes, which I was happy to do. And that's it. That's the only time anyone has ever had an issue with it. So Hope this has been useful talking about how to kind of get insights from the people who are trying to serve, some different ways to approach it, how to um, come up with our focus, our why, different ways to figure out who we need to talk to, some different methods, some what's, and then some of these tips on facilitating an effective session. All right. Questions. We got plenty of time here. Well, 12 minutes for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. This is a great overview.